content of the following program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. I'm an attorney with the law firm Oltman, Flynn & Kubler, where we practice intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. You can visit us online and view all episodes of this show on our website at oltmanpatent.com. That's oltmanpatent.com. I have a special guest this evening. His name's Gus Bravo. Gus is the host of Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil, with his co-host Neil Kodsey. That show airs Monday nights, every Monday night, right here on WNN AM 1470 at 6 o'clock. So definitely want to make everyone aware of that show. That's a great show. And tonight we're going to be discussing some of the recent news this week surrounding the Republican debate and some of the aftermath. So, Gus, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly fine. Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yes, I can. I can hear you well. Thanks for joining us over the phone. So much to talk about. It was a 3-hour debate last Wednesday. I was glued to it. I'm sure you were as well. So many topics that also had some legal angles. I have to start out with a follow-up because just last week when I had Jeff Brown on the show, we were talking about the Kim Davis story in Kentucky. That was the clerk of court that went to jail for 5 days for contempt of court when she refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. Mike Huckabee, among others, came to a rally when she was released the Friday actually before the debate. This was a big news story, and it brought up some issues with respect to the First Amendment right of freedom of religion as it would apply to government officials. It was interesting to see because I was very curious how Mike Huckabee was going to react and if this was going to come up during the debate. It came up once. And what he essentially said, and remember this is coming from a governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee went so far as to say that the Supreme Court is not the only one that can interpret the Constitution, but that a clerk of court can override the Supreme Court's ruling and essentially interpret the Constitution herself. And he even used the term separation of powers, that each government can independently interpret the Constitution. This is quite disturbing that a governor would say something that ludicrous, considering that we've had almost 3 centuries of judicial review, going all the way back to Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court is the only authority that can issue a dispositive ruling interpreting the Constitution. Now we have a governor coming out saying, no, a clerk of court can disagree with the Supreme Court and just do whatever she wants. What are your thoughts on that? I find that to be quite outrageous and disturbing.
Yeah, it's scary, and it's kind of ironic because typically the Republican Party's mantra when it comes to the Supreme Court is, we want justices or judges that are going to strictly construe and stick to the letter of the law. And are not going to be, I think the term they use a lot of times is activist judges taking the law into their own hands or making their own interpretations based on morality, and which is exactly what's going on here. So I think it's a lot of pandering to their political base. Clearly, Huckabee, he had less than, I believe, 5% of the numbers. I think he might have been 2%. Trump and now Fiorini have taken up a lot of the attention. So they have to throw haymakers. They have to say things that are going to be somewhat controversial. But Huckabee's always been very, very conservative when it comes to his religious views, and I think he will not apologize for it. I think his religious views will pretty much trump anything, including any kind of legal views. But you're absolutely right, Jeff. I mean, we've had, I mean, the whole foundation of the country is based on separation of not only church and state, but also the separation of powers. We have a judiciary that interprets the laws. We have a different body that passes the laws, and then we have the executive branch that obviously oversees a lot of the other aspects of it. So yeah, we don't want a clerk of court, particularly one who's been divorced 4 times, to be making her own interpretations about marriage.
Well, the other thing about Kim Davis is she said that it was in defense of her religious belief, but of course this has been fleshed out by legal scholars in the recent weeks, where this is just a really clear-cut case that she voluntarily took this job and she has ministerial duties, and her only criteria for determining whether a couple is entitled to a marriage license is whether they meet the legal requirements of marriage, which has been decided by the courts. There's really nowhere for her to go other than for her to leave her job at this point. She has worked out a compromise where her subordinate deputy clerks are issuing marriage licenses, and she doesn't have to sign them. So she manages to stay out of jail by doing that. But if she intermeddles or interferes any further, she's going to be in contempt of court, and she's going to go back to jail. So I don't really see this going much further unless she's going to have to leave her job. But she has indicated that she doesn't want to leave her job, that she wants to stay there. So she's going to have to grin and bear it. And of course, government officials they don't have the same. Their First Amendment rights don't really extend into their job, where they're allowed to stand in front of somebody else that legitimately has a right because their religious beliefs would interfere with that. So that seems to be pretty much a dead story at this time, but it did come up in the debates, and it is certainly worth mentioning, only because even though Huckabee, like you said, might only be a couple percentage points in the polls, he is on the stage, he is a governor, he is obviously a pretty high up in government. He's a former governor running for president, and he's saying things that are just ludicrously inconsistent with the Constitution, that you really don't need to be an attorney or a constitutional law scholar to figure that out. I mean, you could be an 11th grade history student and figure out the concept of Marbury versus Madison and separation of powers, which Huckabee seems to have some contempt for. But moving on from what's that?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was
going to add. Unfortunately, Huckabee was not the only candidate up there saying some pretty ridiculous things. I mean, obviously, the one leading the whole charge was saying some things, politics aside, that I think fly in the face of well settled, constitutional law. When you're talking about, obviously, I'm referring to Trump.
Yeah, Donald Trump. He said a lot of things. What was it that caught your eye?
No, I just think his policy on immigration itself is, trying to, rewrite the 14th Amendment and talk in terms of, well, if you're, I think they call them anchor babies, and trying to basically say, you shouldn't, excuse me, you shouldn't have the right just because you're born here, you should not automatically get citizenship. Well, that's going to, first of all, in order to get that done, you're going to have to amend the Constitution, and I think you're just going to create a whole series of problems.
Well, he's indicated that he thinks that he can essentially deport people that were born here without amending the Constitution. He thinks that's permissible under the 14th Amendment, even though the 14th Amendment identifies anybody that's born here. There's nothing, and I discussed this with Bradford Cohen, a former apprentice contestant who's an attorney, an immigration attorney actually down in Fort Lauderdale a couple of weeks ago. And it's just going to be very difficult for Trump to reconcile his position with the 14th Amendment, which clearly identifies that any person that's born here in any of the United States that's subject to the jurisdiction of the United States is a citizen. This goes back to something that's called the clear meaning doctrine, which means that if a law, or in this case the Constitution, is clear on its face, you have to go with that. Everything that Trump's talking about is essentially a context argument. He's saying, times have changed. We can't possibly afford to, if somebody just crosses the border when they're 9 months pregnant and has a baby, that now the United States is responsible for that baby for 85 years, Social Security, education, et cetera, for that child. And so that's an interesting argument. You can certainly argue that the Constitution should be changed if that's what he wants to do, but it is really pretty far-fetched to say that is going to override the clear language of the Constitution, because you have to go with the clear meaning.
I don't think the argument will hold much water. I think, whether you believe or not that people that cross here or arrive here illegally should, they have a child born here, whether that child automatically becomes a citizen or not. Whatever your views may be on that, the reality is the Constitution is pretty clear. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States. So you would have to change it. You would have to do an amendment to that 14th Amendment to clarify, and then that opens up a whole other can of worms, because as we know, okay, you're going to make an exception for what? So folks that here are illegally, and so you could come up with a whole host of scenarios where, okay, but that doesn't really fit this scenario, and what about this? I think that's, again, an example of just pandering to the base, and I think trying to change well-settled law. I think they're probably best served to look into other areas.
Well, Trump has indicated that he doesn't want to amend the Constitution. He's said quite openly, well, we're going to find out, in reference to what you just said. He said, we're going to find out, meaning we're going to end up going to court and find out. That means that in order for that to happen, if he were to become president, he would have to start deporting people that were born here and then wait to have legal challenges to that, and then have it go up through the federal courts to the Supreme Court and then get a ruling on what we're talking about. I think we know how it would go. His policy would be ruled unconstitutional with respect to deporting people that were born here because they're citizens. But he's saying that he's just going to do it. That's a bit disturbing. Of course, you have to take everything with a grain of salt because it's coming from Trump. But it's more than a bit disturbing, because what he's essentially saying is he's going to willfully violate the Constitution and just see what happens. And that's really that very much goes against the oath that every public official swears, whether it's Kim Davis as a clerk of court, or whether it's the President of the United States, where you swear to uphold the Constitution.
Certainly would be grounds for impeachment.
It would arguably be grounds of impeachment, for impeachment. And that's, who knows what's going to happen there. I want to move on, because there's just, so much to talk about. We got to talk about Chris Christie saying that he would go ahead and prosecute Hillary Clinton for her email scandal. He cites his former experience as a federal prosecutor, saying that he is the one that would make sure that his Justice Department, whoever he appointed as head of the Justice Department, would go forward with prosecuting Hillary Clinton. He declared during the debate that Hillary Clinton compromised national security, that she leaked classified information, and that this is something that could be a prosecutable offense. As we discussed, you and I, when you were on the show here a few weeks ago, that's not even remotely possible, because there's an intent requirement with respect to leaking classified government material to a third party that doesn't have clearance. There is going to be no evidence at all that Hillary Clinton ever had any such intent, and we still don't know what was leaked. So how Chris Christie knows, but we don't know, is something I don't understand. I don't know what knowledge he has with respect to the leaked information, or even more significantly, what knowledge Chris Christie has with respect to Hillary Clinton's mental state at the time that she installed that server. So it's just not going to happen. With respect to the General Petraeus comparison that's been made, he admitted that he knew the information that he had was classified, and he knew that the source, that his biographer that he was giving that information to did not have security clearance. So he admitted essentially to all of the elements of the crime that he was accused of. We don't have that with Hillary Clinton. There's just no prosecution to be had, and I think it's also reckless and disturbing to have a former federal prosecutor and current governor misrepresent the law like that to say that there is grounds right now to prosecute Hillary Clinton, and he condemned the Obama administration for not doing it. I think that's, again, more pandering, but it's also just reckless and intellectually dishonest. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think and where do we have? We need Neil on this to obviously come in and break the speak from the other side. But I think that look, a prosecutor certainly is just advancing the interests of the state agency for which he or she works for. So yeah, Christie getting up on his soapbox and saying I would have prosecuted her. That's what I would have done. Well, that's fine. I mean, that's their decision to use government resources and taxpayer money to choose which cases they're going to go forward or not. The fact that he would have prosecuted her doesn't. That's just saying he's going to bring charges, but ultimately, as any citizen of this country, she would be entitled to have a defense. She would be entitled, if she wanted to, obviously have a jury of her peers, so to speak, to decide whether or not she committed any criminal act.
But just the fact that he's saying that there's grounds for prosecution alone, I think, is just reckless beyond words.
But the problem is, look, anyone, and I'm sure any criminal defense brother will tell you. Look, a lot of the prosecution they do with very little evidence. You know, they bring in charges. You know, you certainly would love to be in a system that always has enough evidence to bring forward charges, but that's not the reality. The reality is it really depends. A lot of times they will bring charges when they have very little, knowing that they'll put pressure on one party and they'll cave, and they'll give testimony that will give them a bigger fish. So a presidential candidate or a Republican candidate getting up there and saying, I would have done this, I would prosecute, that's fine. I think most people realize that that's really more political driven, which is what all of this is, politically driven. Clearly it is. But it's working. It's having its effect. It stayed in the news cycle. It's not going away. Bernie Sanders surely appreciates it because obviously he's been able to at least get close and get within shooting range of Hillary. So it's having a desired effect. And the fact that bringing charges is one thing. Being able to get a conviction is entirely something different. So I
have to move on here because we only have about 12 minutes left. But just staying on the subject of Chris Christie, it did come up this interchange between him and Rand Paul. It wasn't a big part of the events that evening, but they were talking about marijuana and how Colorado, passed some medical marijuana legislation, and they were talking about that. Chris Christie wants to enforce the federal laws that prohibit marijuana use, and saying, if he becomes president, he will do that. He went into this whole soapbox speech about marijuana being a gateway drug and how it doesn't just affect the user, the user, the person that's smoking marijuana, but it also affects their family members and their employers. So he feels bad for the employers of potheads, not just the potheads themselves, which I had to say that gave me a bit of a chuckle. And then it sort of had this exchange back and forth. I thought an obvious response, and maybe nobody wanted to bring it up, was talking about self-destructive behavior. Chris Christie obviously, and he's admitted it on numerous occasions, obviously has a weight problem. He has probably an eating disorder. Could you imagine? I would have said, could you imagine if the police came in and put him on a strict diet regimen, that if he deviated from it, he would be put in handcuffs and sent to jail? And then you could justify that the same way he did. Say, well, hey, what if you have a heart attack? This is going to affect your family. That would have about the same strength.
Your employer that has to accommodate your obesity. I mean, yeah, there's a whole area avenue he opens himself up for, and I think your point is well taken. There's a lot of hypocrisy, I think, in that. Unfortunately, and I think Neil and I have talked about this before. A lot of these candidates, guys and gals, are lawyers. They're actually, they went to law school, and so obviously Christie, he was a prosecutor. But,
well, it doesn't stop them from obfuscating what the law is and to play upon people's misunderstanding of it. Whether they understand it, they might understand it, but certainly they don't talk as though they do, just given their sound bites and how they speak during the debates. There was also an interplay back and forth between Trump and Fiorina with respect to their various corporate histories. Fiorina criticized Trump because he had declared corporate bankruptcy for, I think, 4 of his casinos in Atlantic City, and that was an issue. Trump criticized Fiorina for her performance at HP and how she was fired and there was lots of layoffs and so forth. This would be an interesting sort of starting point for a discussion about corporate law. I don't see the media taking it in that direction, but I think it would be really interesting because Fiorina was quoted by some of her subordinates in recent days, especially some that had lost their jobs, as saying that if she could get rid of all of the employees and just automate essentially everything at HP to save money, she would do it. And this sort of brings up the whole question about the corporate structure, which is that officers of a corporation, including the CEO, only have a duty to shareholders and to maximize their interests. They have no duty whatsoever to employees. And I think that there was a commentary back in the last election cycle with Mitt Romney where, when they were talking about his history at Bain Capital and saying, I've never heard of an investor ask a CEO how many jobs he created this year, because the people that the CEO answers to, they don't care about that. That's just sort of a front that corporations exist to create jobs, but that's not really why they exist. If they can downsize and save money, they do. So it would be really interesting, and I think this might be a great place if Bernie Sanders, for example, wanted to come out with this position, although he hasn't, to say that there should be some reform of corporate laws to give labor groups and employees votes as to officers of a corporation. They could actually vote a CEO out the same way that shareholders could. That would dramatically change a lot of the discontents associated with our industrial sector going on right now.
Yeah, look, I think you touched on a couple of topics there that probably would be separate shows altogether. One would be the interplay, the corporate world versus the political world. Obviously, those two are often, perhaps always in bed, but a government is not supposed to function like a corporation. A government is not there to maximize profits for shareholders.
There's no bottom line. There's no bottom line for a lot of positions in government. Also, if you think about it, a high school principal doesn't have a bottom line. Test scores are not a bottom line. No. Government is supposed to be there to fill in the gaps and provide the sort of social benefits and be able to obviously maintain a certain social status among the people, protect and advance the common interest. So it's a very different analysis for government than it is a corporation. But I think the second point is well taken. I mean, should a corporation have to answer to more than just its shareholders? I mean, and some people would say, look, the whole foundation of a free market capitalist economy is based on trying to maximize profits, and then you can have a whole, segment on is that the best way? There's a movement now talking about corporate responsibility and corporations, certain more progressive corporations, realizing that there is a benefit to your bottom line if you exercise more responsibility and social awareness as a company. Rather than just making a beeline for the profits. I absolutely agree with that. I want to just add one thing, is that yes, profit seeking is a fundamental aspect of a capitalist economy, but there's another fundamental aspect that's often left out of the discussion quite conveniently, and that is the free market portion. That is, that you have a competitive open market where producers can enter and exit freely, as opposed to monopolistic markets, which is often what we have now, where we have things that are too big to fail, where we just have mergers and acquisitions, which create these super corporations that just take over huge market
You
share.
mean like if you want to get a smartphone, your options are just Samsung and iPhone?
Exactly. Or if you want to watch, we just had a merger with DirecTV and AT&T, and so now for telecommunications, you basically have two choices. It's a duopoly. So you have one more choice than a monopoly. You have two choices for television, and so what ends up happening is it's the opposite of what's supposed to happen in a capitalist system, where you have lots of competitors all competing for the consumer for their dollars. Now you have it where the consumer's choices are so restricted that the monopolies or the duopolies can just charge very, very high prices and provide very poor quality services, and they just get away with it. And that's what's missing from the discussion with respect to a capitalist system.
Absolutely. I think people just, on a very simplistic level, need to get more involved in politics, need to become more aware of their rights. And I think one of the things we have seen this summer with a lot of these changes in social movements is that when folks become more involved and participate, whether it's in the political process, judicial process, whatever have you, it's certainly their voices are heard. Otherwise, look, you can't complain when the structure is run to favor the few over the many.
Well, we have the public relations.
Get involved.
We have the public relations aspect of our media, which just very scrupulously excludes certain key aspects of what's happening in the news, as well as the way that our political and economic system works. Like what we were just talking about right now, there's no discussion at all about whether CEOs should have to answer to people outside of shareholders. There's absolutely no discussion about that. There's no discussion of the fact that just because something's private, that doesn't necessarily make it competitive. We often say, people unfortunately have a view of capitalism that it's just equal to that privatization equals capitalism. That if something's private, it's necessarily an instrument of capitalism, and that's not the case either for the reasons we just discussed. And that's just left entirely out of the public discourse, unfortunately. We have only about a minute left, and we didn't get to all of the things we were going to hopefully talk about, but we got through a lot considering what went on this last week. I just want to plug your show one more time. That's Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil. It airs Monday nights from 6 to 6:30. Gus, if you could give out your contact information to our listeners.
Sure. It's 954-790-6711. Office in Broward County, in Plantation.
Great. I'd like to give a very special thanks to my guest this evening, Gus Bravo. Please tune in next Tuesday evening from 6 to 6:30 for another edition of Talk Legal. I'm Jeff Van Treese, your host. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material of this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program